Doncs bé, benvinguts tots i totes. I, com sabeu, comencem el seminari que enguany arriba a la seva 5a edició, la qual cosa ens fa estar especialment orgullosos i alhora constatar que a Catalunya hi ha interès pels afers de política de defensa, cosa que és el propi d'un país normal, malgrat que altres s'esforcin a dir que no. En qualsevol cas, aquesta 5a edició comencem amb un vell conegut, el tinent coronel retirat Stuart Crawford, del 4 Regiment cuirassat del Regne Unit, que l'any passat el vam tenir en una ponència online sobre el 30è aniversari de l'operació Desert Storm i que, entre altres coses, és conegut per fer un dels documents sobre política de defensa d'una Escòcia independent. Recentment l'ha actualitzat. De fet, ell es va retirar de les Forces de Defensa britàniques fa ja més de 20 anys, però ha continuat la seva carrera també com a consultor sobre afers de seguretat i defensa. I en qualsevol cas, creiem que és una de les veus expertes a les quals calia convidar de cara a donar aquest punt de normalització quan tant es parla del model escocès, però no es va al fons de les coses. Per tant, a partir d'aquí, jo ja callo i tot vostre. So, Stuart, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here to speak to you about a matter of which is, I hope, will be of interest to you. I start off with an apology that I can't deliver this in Catalan. And I can't deliver it in Spanish, I'm afraid. And I can't even deliver it in English because I'm Scottish. So you'll just have to bear with me in my Scottish diction. And just a word of warning, because I was born in Glasgow and people from Glasgow speak very, very quickly. So if I get carried away with myself, just put your hand up and I'll slow down a little bit. And we'll see how it goes from there. Anyway, absolutely delighted to be here. Some of you may know, some of you may not know that I've been pretty interested from my military background in how an independent Scottish state in the future might go about raising and designing and organising its armed forces. And I've been doing this for the last 20 years. And so what I'm going to try and do tonight is describe not just one model, which is the first sort of model that I came up with my colleague Richard Marsh, but describe the second model that we've sort of moved on to as geopolitics changed, and then maybe sort of look at where the third model might be against the background of the Ukraine war, which has sort of knocked everything for six. But of course, it's only a model, it's not the model, there are lots of other models around, but I think it's the only model of independent Scottish Defence Forces, or SDF, which has been costed, and that is thanks to my colleague Richard Marsh, who is an economist and an economic advisor to the Scottish Government, so his credentials are much better than mine. Now, one of the questions that people frequently ask me when I talk about this topic is, why have any armed forces at all? Why do you bother? Why not let Scotland just become a neutral country, a bit like Ireland maybe if you like, and rely on some sort of police or gendarmerie arrangement to deal with crime and internal security matters? In other words, the classic, and I think flawed argument that if you don't have any armed forces at all, then nobody will want to fight you. But I think the question is fair enough, if a little naive. So I thought I might just start off by offering a few thoughts on what I think armed forces are actually for. Now this I've thought about for a wee while so far. It's not original thought, but I think it's worth going through just as background to where we're going. So the first thing I would suggest to you is that armed forces are required to ensure the survival of the state against internal enemies, and the next click please, the state's ultimate argument against non-democratic insurrection, and I emphasise non-democratic because obviously protest has a perfectly valid part in any democracy, and uprising. And in addition to this, there are a host of other tasks associated with assisting civilian authorities, like helping with disaster relief, ensuring essential supplies continue during periods of industrial dispute, although that's a slightly sort of politically difficult area, and so on. And examples from the UK recently have been the Royal Air Force using their Chinook helicopters to carry ballast and gravel to secure a dam that was going to burst, soldiers being used to put out widespread fires in the countryside when the ground is dry, although it's not very often dry in Scotland, I have to say, but we do have dry patches sometimes. And when I was a boy, I can remember in Glasgow, growing up in Glasgow, the refuse collectors, the trash men, went on strike, and the situation got so dire that eventually the army was pulled in to deal with that. And that's the sort of thing that it can do. So I think that's a very important aspect. It's not all about blowing up things and killing people. It's also supporting the civilian authorities. The second thing, if I have the next one, is to protect the state against external enemies, which is a pretty obvious one, and act, and I quote here, as the political affirmation of sovereignty and identity which results from a visible determination to define and patrol frontiers and areas of interest with military forces. Now, clearly this includes policing of airspace, sea routes, and of particular relevance in the Scottish context, the guarding of oil and gas installations, although those resources have a reduced significance in the modern economy. And the third, if I could have the next one, and the next one after that as well, please, that's it. The third main reason for having armed forces is to promote stability in regions of the globe where the state has political, economic, or strategic interests. But much more likely than armed intervention, I would suggest, is the achievement of political ends by low-level military assistance, exchange training, military links through attendance at foreign staff colleges, and diplomacy. And there also may be a need to rescue nationals from areas of conflict or embassy staff in the face of some crisis. And I think the debacle in Afghanistan recently, when everybody had to bail out in short notice, is an example of that. And that can be done either unilaterally or in alliance or coalition with others. But if you accept the argument that these are the three main reasons for having armed forces, then their use becomes essentially a matter of choice. For example, participation in operations like peace or stability operations under the auspices of organizations like NATO or the UN or the EU. And these sort of participations can enhance a state's standing in the international community and give it what we call a seat at the conference table, so that it's actually part and parcel of the decision-making process. But here, the decision to become involved would not rest with the government, or become involved or not, would rest with the government of the day, and certainly in the Scottish context would be subject to parliamentary approval. So that's why I think you have armed forces, and we can Q&A at that at the end if anyone has any points on that. The next thing I did when I was looking at the Scottish context was to try and see what the Scottish foreign policy might be, to put it in context, and where its focus might be on foreign affairs. Now, there's not, as far as I'm aware, a statement from any Scottish party what a Scottish foreign policy might look like, apart from a sort of general feeling that we'd like to be everybody's friend and be a good neighbour. The SNP, which you will know is the main party pushing for independence in Scotland, wants to rejoin the EU because we had that wonderful thing called Brexit, which is an ongoing disaster that just keeps giving, and also wants Scotland to join NATO. And that's been a policy change over the past 10 years because previously they were very anti-NATO. But the SNP also has a strong anti-war posture and is particularly against the stationing of the UK's independent nuclear deterrent, which just happens to be based in Scotland. And I'm going to return to the nuclear weaponry and the Trident missiles and the submarines again and again ad nauseam, because it's the major factor in Scottish defence things. However, it seems to me sensible that an independent Scotland would not wish to continue the global commitments and ambitions of the UK as a whole, and would be much more likely to have a regional rather than a worldwide focus, in military terms at least, which of course has a fairly fundamental impact on how one might want to organise the armed forces. So I accept and would suggest that Scotland's focus would be European rather than global, with special emphasis on Scandinavia and the High North. And we can return to this again in questions. I'd like to now move on to look at how I think you would go about designing armed forces. Most of the general commentary on this has either been along the lines of what I call the comparative approach, where people have taken similar small countries like Denmark or New Zealand and have said that we're very same size population, same sort of general economic situation, so we will have the same armed forces as they have. Or there is the financially driven model, where politicians, generally speaking, tend to say the average spend across NATO countries or European countries or Scandinavian countries is a certain percentage of the national GDP, and therefore our defence budget, annual defence budget, will be that proportion. And for that budget, we can buy this, 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 and this. Now, I think both of those approaches are unsatisfactory. And a slightly more scientific approach is called for. And it's remarkably simple, actually. In concept, it has 3 stages. First, you have to decide what the risks and threats might be to the new state and where your friends and allies are. Second, you have to decide what armed forces you might want to have to deal with the threats and risks and to take advantage of your friends and allies in coalition. And finally, you have to work out whether the country can afford to pay for them. And that's always the killer question: can we afford them? And if the answer to question 3 is, on the first iteration, is no, we can't afford it, then you have to go through it all again, compromise, double hatting, make one unit do 2 jobs, and until you get to an acceptable defence budget and defence profile in terms of your armed forces. And it's not, that's not a difficult process, but it's remarkable the number of people that don't want to do that. So let's just very quickly look at what the risks and threats to an independent Scotland might be and who would be our friends and allies. I think and again, the most important part of the process is defining what might be the risks and threats that we might want to defend ourselves against. And I quote directly from a recent commentator who said, "It is a near certainty that an independent Scotland would face no military threat from any other state, and therefore the threat to Scottish territorial integrity in the short to medium term is extremely low." Now, Scotland's traditional enemy has been, of course, historically, has been England. And our historical ally has been the French. But nowadays, both of them are members of NATO, as you know, and, well, England is part of the UK. And an independent Scotland also would wish to join NATO, I would strongly suggest. So I think we can discount that historical threat. So the threats and risks to an independent Scotland which might necessitate a military response are likely to be of lower key and a different nature. If any threats were to emerge at all, they would seem to be likely to be limited to infringements of airspace, coastal integrity, security of oil and gas, as I've mentioned, other economic assets like fishing grounds, which is a very emotive one in Scotland, threats to physical and non-physical communication networks, air and sea routes, internet cabling, which runs under the North Sea, and so on. And of course, recently there's been a flurry of media interest in cyber warfare, disinformation, and so on. So all that has to be taken into account. Now, of course, terrorism is another threat which requires both a military and a security response. And to this, we need to add the internal risks of, and again stress, undemocratic process, social unrest, and natural disasters. And the final aspect is that I would strongly suggest that the government of an independent Scotland would at least wish to retain the option to contribute to overseas operations in coalition or alliance. So, what would I Scotland need to counter such threats? And this is the major question we have to ask ourselves. Now, there are no surprises, because I'm a conventional man from a conventional military background, that I would follow or recommend a conventional approach, including naval, army and air force elements, which together would form the Scottish Defence Force. You don't have to do it that way, but that's the way that I'm most at home with. So let's run with that, and we can discuss other ways of doing it at some other point. Now, our biggest study of this was published by the Royal United Services Institute in 2012, and it was called "All the Blue Bonnets Defending an Independent Scotland," which was written by me and my economist friend Richard Marsh. And I think that the central arguments, or the central tenets, if you like, of that remain sound. We've talked about the regional focus rather than global, the option to contribute to international and global interventions, and that, importantly, that creating and maintaining what I call a full spectrum military capability would be beyond, initially at least, a small nation of some 5.5 million souls. So, in other words, the SDF, the Scottish Defence Forces, would not be a sort of mini UK armed forces, and therefore would go down the path of military specialisation and niche capability, with gaps in natural indigenous capability being filled by membership of NATO and the emerging EU defence arrangements with other countries, bigger countries, which have different or better attributes in various areas. But I've always advocate that an independent Scotland should identify something that we might be naturally very good at, and be able to recommend that to international coalitions and peacetime operations and all that sort of stuff. And the one that everyone's jumped upon is providing the best equipped, best trained, most professionally competent field hospitals in the world, because that's very touchy-feely. It's not war making, it's peace making, but it might be in a war context, and the application goes across the board from civilian disaster all the way up to general war. So people have bought into that one. Can I have the next one? Oh, keep going. Okay, so this is the original model that we came up with in our first paper. And you'll see from the slide that and I was suggesting it might comprise a navy of between 20 and 25 vessels, and some, 1,500 to 2,000 personnel, an army of between 10,000 and 12,500 personnel, and an air force of about 60 airframes and approximately 1,750 to 250 personnel. The paper was of the opinion, when we wrote it, that existing British Armed Service bases in Scotland could be used or adapted for SDF use, and that all three services would be equipped, at least initially, by their inherited share of the British military inventory, perhaps supplemented by off-the-shelf purchases in the future. And I say share because Scottish taxpayers have already contributed to the British military inventory, and it's entirely appropriate that some sort of allocation of that previous expenditure should be made. We can argue about whether that's done on population head or, Scotland's 8% of the UK's population, but it's 50% of the land mass, and it's got 2/3 of the coastal thing. So there's all sorts of different things ways that can be divvied up. It's just not a case of taking 8% of the population, therefore you're entitled to 8% of the military equipment. I think there's room for some considerable negotiation there. But for cost reasons, we wouldn't be able to maintain the full military spectrum, and specialisation would be required. I thought it highly unlikely that the SDF would wish or be able to procure and operate what I call high-end military equipment like submarines, aircraft carriers, tanks, attack helicopters, and modern fast jet fighters. And so we dropped them from the model. And the reason we dropped them from the model mainly is they're far too expensive, both to obtain and to run on a small tax base of, half of the population of Scotland. And finally, we estimated the cost of the model was somewhere in the region of 1.5 to 1.8 billion pounds per annum. And just to put that in context, the UK defence budget is 46 billion pounds per annum. And I think that we're almost on equivalence between the euro and the pound at the moment. There's not even a cigarette paper between the different costs. So that was our sort of first report for RUSI, and that was a sort of a labour of love. No one paid us for it. We did it. I sent the paper down for someone to the RUSI think tank just to read it, and they said, "Oh, would you like us to publish it?" And I was quite flattered that they wanted to publish it because RUSI is pretty serious stuff. So that was that. However, and let me just take a quick sip of water. Much water has now flowed under the bridge since that report. It's now 10 years old, and it needed to be updated. So we updated it briefly about 5 years ago. And we did so because there had been major developments in both the geopolitical and defence spheres, which required us to adapt our thinking to produce a new updated model, which would be fit for the new world order of the middle 21st century. Just by way of background, in global geopolitics, we saw the shift in US foreign policy focus from Europe to the Pacific. We can argue whether that's still the case. And more specifically, to looking towards North Korea and the continuing emergence of China as a major economic and military power. At the same time, the US and its allies were, and probably still are, still embroiled in a seemingly never-ending series of wars and conflicts in the Middle East, while at the same time they were beginning to look askance at Russia's evolving military adventurism. Closer to home, the UK had decided, for reasons that baffle me, but there you are, voted to leave the European Union, and that has turned into a tortuous and seemingly never-ending process of surprises and counter-surprises. The transition period was meant to be 2 years. Well, you'll be really lucky if you get it done in 10 years. But we are where we are. On top of that, as you'll probably be aware, the Scottish independence referendum was held in 2014. And surprising to many, and a disappointment of many as well, a majority of Scots voted to remain part of the United Kingdom. Now, the voting at the referendum, and indeed in the polling ever since, has turned out almost the same figures if you flatten out the polling curves. 55% of Scots who vote wish to remain in the UK, and 45% of Scots who vote wish to become independent. And that's been stuck at that, more or less, for the last 10 years. So perhaps in Q&A, if you want, we can look at why that might be the case and what can be done to unstick that process. But at the moment, sadly, that's where we're stuck. But the whole constitutional question of independence politically has not gone away, and there have been calls to hold another one every year since the last one in 2014. And we've now been told by our SNP-led government in the Scottish Parliament that they will hold another referendum on October 19 next year, 2023. But to be perfectly honest with you, I don't actually see that happening. And as I said, we can return to why that might be the case in Q&A if you so wish. So that's Scotland out to one side. Obviously, militarily, when we revised our model, we faced a much changed landscape. In NATO, the USA had been signalling, particularly under Donald Trump, their current dissatisfaction with the levels of defence spending. You'll know that NATO has a sort of recommended lower limit of 2% of GDP, and out of the, and now I'm going to embarrass myself because I don't know how many nations are now in NATO. Out of the 28 nations in NATO, say, only about 3 or 4 spend over 2%, and many spend well under. But of course, that's changing rapidly because of the Ukraine situation. But Donald Trump actually threatened to pull the USA out of NATO altogether. And that would be a disaster because the main purpose of NATO, as I think everybody knows, is through Article 5. An attack on one is taken as an attack on all. And it keeps the USA and Canada involved in European geopolitics. And without the USA, arguably, you could say that NATO is actually nothing. But we'll see what's going. Anyway, so Donald Trump was threatening to pull up the USA out of the alliance. China was emerging as a serious contender. North Korea has been testing nuclear weapons and missiles, etc., etc., etc. And the Middle East remains a mess. And the Israeli-Palestine situation doesn't look as if it will be resolved at any time soon, which is very sad. And at the same time, and this we're talking 5 years ago, Russia had become much more military aggressive with the annexation of the Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk provinces in the Donbass area. And their naval activity in the Baltic was quite marked. And on top of all of that, Britain recommitted itself, the UK, recommitted itself to a global military strategy, which is best sort of illustrated by the massive investment in 2 aircraft carriers. And I don't know what the final cost ended up, but it was certainly rather more than was budgeted for. And also on top of that are the country's continuing adherence to the continuous at-sea deterrent, the nuclear deterrent. We have 4 nuclear-armed submarines. We've got lots of nuclear-powered submarines. 4 nuclear-armed submarines with the Trident D5 missile. And the UK policy is to have 1 at sea all the time. So 1 at sea, 1 training, 1 refurbing, and 1 on standby or something like that. And nobody, well, some people must know where they are, but I've got no idea where they go and what they do when they're there. But they go off for 6 months, and then they sort of return and are replaced by another one. And obviously the purpose of that is that our enemies cannot risk a first strike strategy with nuclear weapons because they know that there will be retaliation. So it's the old sort of 1960s, 1970s mutually assured destruction scenario, which everybody feels really finds, I think, really sort of perverse and sort of counterintuitive. But there you are. The only time that nuclear weapons have ever been used in war is when one side had them and the other side didn't. So we have to bear that in mind, I think. But anyway, against all this background, the UK was struggling to match its defence aspirations with its defence budget, and calls were made for further reduction in our armed services overall. So against that background of 5 years ago context, we then envisaged a scenario where an independent Scotland might shift its defence and military emphasis away from the army heavy model we proposed in 2012, and argued that providing infantry troops was probably no longer Scotland's strongest suit. And you know that we've produced lots of kilted and regiments over the years, which have in many ways been used as the shock troops of the Empire, together with the Australians and the Canadians and the New Zealanders. But basically Scotland's run out of people for that sort of job. And we reduced the budget down from the 1.5 to 1.8 billion, which we had previously identified. But the continuity of thought was that most, or if not all, of the defence inventory, the equipment inventory, would still come from our share of the UK's, although there are many items that an independent Scotland wouldn't want. I mean, we don't want 8% of an aircraft carrier. We don't want an aircraft carrier at all, but I mean, so obviously there's lots of stuff coming and go there. So we continue to see no utility for high-end weaponry, discounted aircraft carriers, submarines, tanks, army attack helicopters, heavy artillery, and fast jet aircraft, and of course new nuclear weapons. Although the continuing presence of the Trident missile system on the submarines on the naval base on the Clyde near to Glasgow will be touched upon in a bit more detail in a second. So just to illustrate, and remembering that this was actually a work in progress, in general terms we changed to a revised model, which you can see here. The most marked reduction of which is the reduction in army personnel, because we thought that it was probably more realistic to be able to produce at best a deployable brigade, which is anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000 troops, depending how you design it and what it's to do and what its support logistics will be. And the rest of the stuff you can see in the slide. Not specific on what sort of vehicle. I mean, people always love to say, well, we'll have a squadron of F-16s and a squadron of this. We didn't go down to the weeds, the detail, because I'm not an expert air warfare officer or commentator, and there are other people who are better doing these things. So we were trying to just provide the broad context. But with the addition of HQ and support staff, we came up with about a total of 11,000 personnel, which is about a third less than our last model. And we also suggested for the first time that a ratio of 70 regular to 30 reserve personnel might be appropriate. And that has cost reduction implications as well. But I just want to emphasize again, this is just our model, not the definitive model by any means. And others might have better ideas. So we've been through the first two processes. And what I want to talk about now is whether we can afford it. And we updated the calculations from our original report, and following the new revised model, we thought that the annual defence budget would come down for about half a billion pounds to 1.1 billion to 1.3 billion per annum. Now the SNP set up their own very general defence policy document, and they suggested that the target should be spending 1.6% of GDP on defence, which is below the NATO target of 2%, which produces a defence budget of 2.7 billion, which is considerably more than we are suggesting. So I phoned up the guy who wrote their white paper on independence, a guy called Andrew Wilson, who's a very clever and able person, but not a military person, and asked him where he got his figure from, and the answer was that he pulled it out of the air. So, you have to take things with a pinch of salt, because that's the way people do things. So we were suggesting realising savings of up to 2 billion a year, give or take a few. But it still falls short of the NATO minimum defence spending target. But I think that we were of the opinion that Scotland's strategic location and military assets could be offered as a sort of partial quid pro quo, possibly I've mentioned the naval base, but possibly including the Royal Air Force base at Lossiemouth in the northeast of Scotland, and I'll talk about that again in a second. So everything, we were feeling quite pleased with ourselves actually. We'd sort of revised our thinking and thought that makes sense, and nobody told us we were talking complete nonsense, which is always a good sign that you're roughly on the right lines. And then Ukraine came along on February 24th this year, and speaking as someone who spent a considerable period of time as a member of the British Army of the Rhine when I was a serving soldier, I never ever thought a moment would come after the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War came to an end, that 30 years later we'd be experiencing once again modern conventional armoured warfare in Europe. And yet this is where we are. Now obviously the Ukraine war has had a major effect on defence planning in Europe and further afield. In the UK as a whole, for example, we have been so focused on the sort of lower intensity operations that we've been involved in places like Afghanistan and Iraq over the past 20 years that arguably we've taken our eye off the ball. That's a football analogy. Does this city have any football analogy? I'm not really sure. Anyway, no, so taking the eye off the ball. And we allowed our armed forces to reduce dramatically. And even on current planning, Our army is set to reduce to a mere 72,500 personnel in total, the smallest army Britain will ever have had since Napoleonic times. We also plan to cut our tank strength, main battle tank strength, from 227, which is pretty pathetic anyway. When I was serving in Germany, we had 900 in Germany alone. But we're going to reduce from 227 to a really miserly 148. Which is no good to anybody, really. And our infantry fighting vehicles and artillery systems are either obsolete or obsolescent. So the Ukraine war has been a wake-up call and has shaken both military chiefs and politicians out of their complacency. Our new Prime Minister in the UK, Liz Truss, who you've probably seen on the TV, has pledged to increase the UK's defence spending from its 2.1% of GDP, which, as I said, was roughly 46 billion, to 3% of GDP by 2030. Now, I don't know what GDP will be in 2030 because it's almost impossible to predict. But I understand that those who are better off in their economic knowledge than I am say that it will equate to roughly an additional £150 billion over the 8-year period between now and then, which is a considerable increase. Of course, much depends on economic growth and inflation, but at least it's a welcome sign. It's a sign of intent, if you like. How this is all going to impact on our thoughts on independent Scotland defence planning, it's actually just too early to say. It's still ongoing, so we're only 6 months into it. But there are some big lessons from Ukraine which I think are quite clear. And the first of these is that numbers matter. You need to have defence resources that are numerous enough and have enough redundancy built into them to sustain losses. Historically, victory usually goes to the big battalions. Second, modern conventional warfare consumes enormous amounts of men and materiel. For example, peacetime predicted rates of artillery consumption, done by the planners in peacetime, have proved to be woefully inadequate. And peacetime stocks of ammunition need to be much greater in the future. And yet this can't be done overnight. Arms manufacturers need time and investment to ramp up production levels. And in Britain's case, some of our manufacturing capability has gone altogether. So we either have to buy abroad or start from scratch. And third, from the Ukraine conflict and experience, is despite all the current emphasis on what they call grey warfare, war in the shadows and short of conflict and short of combat, and cyber and information warfare, you still need the boring old conventional stuff: tanks, artillery, infantry, engineers, logistics, air defence, medical services, etc., to win battles and to win wars. And as the UK's current Chief of the General Staff, the senior soldier, General Sir Patrick Sanders, said recently, you can't cyber warfare your way across a contested river crossing. So the old skills and resources remain critical. But having moved away in the Scottish context from our original army-heavy plan, we might now have to look at switching back slightly, at least a little bit of the way. And we'll certainly have to take notice of the patterns of warfare that have emerged over the past 6 months. Primarily the impact of drones and unmanned, or uncrewed if you prefer, aerial vehicles, the vulnerabilities of armoured fighting vehicles to attack from above, and the need for integrated air defence at all levels, short, medium and long range. So that's the sort of future work that my colleague Richard Marsh and I need to set our hats at. However, while I'm sort of relatively old and in charge of my own schedule, he has a young family and he may have other priorities at the moment. So who knows when it's going to happen. How am I doing? Okay, there are two other areas which I'd just like to consider before finishing, if I may. And I want to come back to what I call the elephant in the room, the presence of Her Majesty's Naval Base Clyde at Faslane, just outside Glasgow, and the home of the UK's independent nuclear deterrent. In Scottish defence discussions, all roads eventually lead to Faslane and the Trident missile system. And I think it's quite important that I should make my own personal view of nuclear weaponry clear. So let me just indulge myself for a minute and a bit. I believe that from a moral and ethical standpoint, nuclear weaponry is so indiscriminate, sophisticated targeting systems notwithstanding, it is so powerful that huge collateral damage to people and property is unavoidable, and that no civilized country would contemplate using it. In the UK context, I don't think the UK independent deterrent is truly independent, in that I cannot imagine the United Kingdom ever using it without at least the tacit approval of the USA. Although I do understand that technically the UK can launch the Trident missile system, even though they are American missiles, which we lease from the USA and put our own warheads on them. Technically, it can be launched without any assistance technologically from the USA, because they have independent targeting systems. Everybody thinks that nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, fly by GPS, but they don't. They fly by astral navigation. And that's about as much about astral navigation as I know, but there may be an expert here who can explain it further. They fly by the stars, basically. And nor do I think it's a deterrent. It didn't deter the Argentinians in 1982, in the Falklands, oblique Malvinas, nor the Iraqis in 1990, when I was out in the sandy places, nor the Taliban, nor Al-Qaeda. And nor do I truly believe that there is a credible nuclear threat to UK interests from so-called rogue states like Iran and North Korea. It might stop the UK being bullied by Russia, but even that I'd need someone to convince me. So I believe that the Trident missile system is essentially a political weapon and not a military weapon, and its main function is to maintain the United Kingdom in the front rank of global powers and guarantee continuing national membership of the UN Security Council, NATO, etc., etc. And that is what the successive UK governments have supported. However, its maintenance and eventual replacement places an enormous burden on the UK's defence budget and soaks up vast funds which would be far better spent on the UK's conventional forces. More ships for the Royal Navy, better equipment for the Army, better paying conditions for all service personnel, and better provision for ex-service personnel when they leave the armed services and try to make the transition into civilian life, which is something that we're actually very poor at in Britain. So Trident's a weapon system which has no conceivable use, far too costly when other priorities shouldn't prevail, and my personal view is that the UK shouldn't replace it when it becomes redundant, but I think I've lost that argument. However, what would an independent Scotland do with the presence on the Clyde and our territory if independence is achieved of the UK's nuclear deterrent? Well, I think it's highly unlikely that Trident would vanish from the Clyde the day after a yes vote, no matter how much folk might wish that to be the case. And lots of people do wish that to be the case. And I say this for two reasons. The first is, realistically, there's nowhere else for it to go in the short to medium term, should the rest of the UK wish to retain it. And second, it could be that the presence of Trident on the Clyde would be one of the biggest bargaining chips that an independent Scotland might have. Its limited continuing presence for, say, another 10 to 20 years after independence could be exchanged for whichever or whatever concessions a Scottish government might seek in the independence negotiations, whether they be financial, economic or military, if an acceptable compromise can be found. And we shouldn't, we can't, in this modern age, lose sight of the fact that the naval base on the Clyde is the second largest single site employer in Scotland, with probably over 11,000 jobs directly or indirectly related to the Royal Navy presence there. So just to be clear, I don't think there's any argument that nuclear weapons should remain in Scotland in the long term, but I do think that possibly the best time for it to be removed is when the current system becomes redundant and is about to be replaced by the new dreadnought submarine fleet, whenever that might be. Demanding its removal quickly would be arguably calling for the UK to unilaterally disarm, and the chance of that happening is close to zero. The USA, for one, and I've had discussions at a fairly senior level with US diplomats, in fact, a very senior level, wouldn't countenance it and have said openly that they would block NATO, Scotland's accession to NATO. So it looks likely that we will have submarines on the Clydes for perhaps the next 10 to 20 years, even if we do achieve independence. This being the case, then, it seems perfectly reasonable to me to suggest that an independent Scotland could lease or rent the base to the remainder of the UK for the period. The question comes up, of course, how much could the Scottish Government charge the rest of the UK? And there's been lots and lots of discussion between how much it would cost to replace the base somewhere else in Britain or even abroad. But Richard Marsh and I, my economist friend, reckon that a realistic rental figure would be something in the order of £200 million per year. Some people think that's woefully low, but we think it's realistic. And other figures are overly ambitious and not credible. So I think the most pragmatic course for both the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government is to accept that it's going to stay there for the time being and that there'll be some exchange of cash until other facilities might become available. Now, very briefly, a similar exercise could be undertaken with regard to the Royal Air Force's presence in Scotland. There's only one operational airbase left in Scotland, and that's at RAF Lossiemouth in the northeast of the country. If you imagine it geographically, it's between Inverness and Aberdeen, roughly. And it houses 4 squadrons of the RAF Typhoon fighter force, and also has become the home of our new Poseidon maritime reconnaissance aircraft fleet. I think we've got 8 now out of a total of 9. And they're operational from there. But it's also importantly used by both the Norwegians and the US Poseidon maritime aircraft, with the US putting $80 million of funding not so long ago into US personnel accommodation and runway improvements there. And both of our original and advised models, as I've described, were predicated on the likelihood that Scotland could not afford a fast jet force, with only some training aircraft perhaps, which begs 2 questions. How would we secure our air defence? And what would happen to RAF Lossiemouth if it was no longer allowed to the RAF's 4 Typhoon squadrons currently in residence? And then there's also the fact that the rest of the UK would still want to secure, or presumably would want to secure, its maritime reconnaissance aircraft force there. So the answer might be, again, as a little similar to the submarine force, that we might lease out all or some of the facilities there to the Royal Air Force or to NATO or to both, and they can continue to pursue their interests there. And we could argue that the base has already become a de facto NATO airbase. So why not just go the whole 9 yards, if you like, and formalise the arrangement between the Scottish and UK governments? It's not quite as straightforward as the submarine base, because there's an element of quid pro quo in protecting, you have the base and you protect our airspace. Similarities with the Irish model to a certain extent. But nonetheless, a leasing option should return some revenue to Scotland. I haven't got time to deal with it in the main presentation, but Richard Marsh and I have actually done some additional work in which we suggested that leasing out the naval base and leasing out the Royal Air Force base would return sufficient revenue for an independent Scotland to be able to pay to get its armed forces for nothing, scot-free, which is quite, the media like the scot-free bit, so at no expense. So that's an interesting one. I've talked for long enough. Just very quickly, final slides. The first one, please. Specialisation. And again, who am I to tell Catalonia how to organise its armed forces? But I think that if you think about the cost of trying to provide everything against the cost of trying to do a few things really, really well, and supplying that facility to your friends and allies and letting them fill the gaps, I think that maybe is a sort of pragmatic way to go in organising your armed forces. Second one is budgets. I just wanted to reiterate, the budget is a political decision, not a military decision. Ideally, the military has a huge input into it, but in the final analysis, if the military asks for a military budget of $5 billion a year and the politicians say, well, you can have $1 billion a year, there's not very much you can do about it. So that has to be borne in mind. And the final one I've spoken about already is the UK's nuclear deterrent and the difficulties that brings. I've spoken for far too long, so I hope you didn't fall asleep or get bored or anything like that. But that's really summarises all our thinking. And there's stuff that you can read online if that's what you want to do. But I'm absolutely delighted, if that be the case, to take any questions on military things, on politics, on football,
Well, not so far. But, well, thank you, Stuart. Also, thank you, Stuart. Bravo, Zulu. So now we'll proceed with the Q&A.
Yep.
Bé, doncs, com sabeu, sempre procurem que siguin unes conferències el més interactives possibles. I bé, com en altres ocasions, ara és la vostra. Un momentet. Ho tirem enrere. Ara. Doncs, com sempre, podeu dir la vostra, preguntar i, en definitiva, tot allò que se us acudeixi. De futbol no cal, però aquí estem. Així doncs, vosaltres mateixos. El teniu aquí i de franc.
Jo volia preguntar una cosa, perquè ell diu que necessita militar, perquè, per exemple, els russos van invadir Afganistan, van tenir que sortir del camp, malgrat que tots els militars estaven... És que no puc parlar en anglès.
No pateixi, jo li tradueixo, sí.
Els Estats Units van anar a Afganistan, va tenir que sortir també, i tenien un exèrcit molt ben preparat, no? Costa Rica, per exemple, no té exèrcit, que jo sàpiga.
Sí, però la pregunta és?
La pregunta és per què és tan necessari tenir un exèrcit.
Sembla que ho explicat al principi.
Sí, dic perquè diu que ha de ser especialitzat, que hem de gastar tots millors, i tot i així, no, els millors que estan aquí sí que tenen especialitat, els millors que havien de gastar. I doncs jo em pregunto, tots aquests exèrcits que estan tan preparats a vegades tampoc aconsegueixen res.
D'acord, ara mira dos sumaritges. She has we're focusing in the counterinsurgency campaigns like Afghanistan, which is the reason to have an army in scenarios where conventional armies have been defeated. She puts the example of Afghanistan, but we can have other examples in counterinsurgency, which is the main point of having an armed forces when you have non-state actors then can defeat you.
Yes. Oh, they can. Yes. I mean, I think there's no doubt that one of the major struggles that conventional militaries had in the Afghanistan campaign, but also in the Iraq campaign to a certain extent, was how to deal with an opposition that doesn't want to play the game, if I can put it that way. And it's very difficult. You just have to, I'm afraid, last the course sometime and accept the fact that you are not ideally organised to deal with this, what I would call asymmetric warfare. But armies do adapt. And the point I was trying to make was that the British Army adapted to the extent that it forgot everything else. And now conventional warfare is back and we're not ready for it. That's the point I was trying to make.
Sí? Val. I a punt, Costa Rica potser no té forces armades, però el fet de no tenir-les ve a compte de que els Estats Units, per mandat constitucional, tinguin barra lliure a Costa Rica. Per tant, són un protectorat. Bernat.
No, I'm going to try to do it in English, but I'm sorry if you don't...
Scottish, please, Scottish.
No, I'm just saying that what would you say if our status quo ends? I mean, you're saying that our armies of smaller nations should be about specialization.
Yes.
But what happens if that status quo of NATO ends? And I'm doing a what if scenario, which is highly unlikely, but I'm just saying that what happens if that's...
Well, I mean, it's a very good question because all conventional defence, if you like, in Europe, certainly if you like, on our side, is predicated around NATO, and to a certain extent with the EU, but really around NATO. And if NATO collapsed, then all the agreements and understandings about who would provide who with what in terms of specialisation would have to be completely and utterly reconsidered. Now, I think if NATO collapsed and, for example, let's say Catalonia had specialised in...
Navy.
Yes, Navy. And suddenly, and said, no, we don't need an army and we don't need an air force because NATO will cover that. And then NATO collapsed, then you would be in trouble. But I don't think it would be impossible for a small country to set up other alliances and coalitions which would cover the possibilities. I mean, it's hypothetical, but then all defence planning is hypothetical until you're actually in combat. So, it's a great question. What happens if NATO goes away? I don't think it will go away. And I think it's hugely important for the security of Europe that we've got the USA tied in. I talked about Article 5. An attack on one is to be seen as an attack on all. Article 5 has only been declared once, and that was after the 9/11 attack on the Twin Towers, and when all the other NATO countries came to the assistance of the USA. And of course, that's not how everybody thought it would work. They all thought it would work the other way around. So, but it's a good question. I mean, again, it's it's well worth considering.
David?
I think you answered about this in some way, but I wanted to ask specifically about why you didn't contemplate a conscription model for Scotland.
Ooh, now that is a good one. That's a very good one. Why did we not do conscription? Well, the basic reason is because we are familiar with not having conscription. And conscription in the UK as a whole, in Scotland, ended in 1962. The first generation not to be drafted into the British Army were the Beatles, basically, that generation. And since then, we've had a professional army and professional armed services. And before the First World War in 1914, the British Armed Forces were always all volunteer professional. So for us, having conscription or the draft has been only during times of national emergency. First World War, when we ran out of men, sadly, and the Second World War, when our resources were exhausted. So we didn't think about conscription because we just weren't in that mind frame. And I think that if there was some sort of war of national survival in an independent Scotland, then conscription would very much be considered.
Yeah.
You talked about how it's sometimes difficult to get veterans to rejoin civilian life effectively, and I wanted to ask, does it have something to do with the training of modern military as compared to the training that, for example, the conscripts would face in World War II, for example, or World War I? Something has changed that makes it more difficult?
Well, yes. I mean, our military is much smaller. It's professional, so people go into for a career, whereas during the World Wars, you went in for the duration of the war, and if you were lucky enough to survive, then you wanted to get out as quickly as possible. And because so many people had gone into the military from industry was crying out for people to come and rejoin, and so they could continue with life as normal. A lot of people find it very difficult to settle from the British military back into civilian life because the military service in the military has become something which is not rare, but it's unusual in civilian society. And so when I did 20 years in the army, and when I came out, and I was lieutenant colonel and I'd been to 3 staff colleges and done all sorts of stuff, And when I came out, I couldn't get a job. I could not get a job in civilian society because what I couldn't demonstrate was that my organisational skills, and I think they were considerable after 20 years, I couldn't demonstrate to a civilian employer how that would result in the generation of revenue, of money, because I'd never done it. You know, I could attack any hill in Western Europe that you like, and if you asked me to take 3 nuns and a pink elephant to Mongolia, I could do it. You know, these are the things I could do. But if someone said, can you take this call centre, which is failing, and turn it around and make it profitable, I just didn't have that experience. So that's why it's difficult. It's also exacerbated in the UK and in Scotland because there is no Department of Veterans Affairs in central government like there is in the USA, Australia, New Zealand, etc., etc. There's a sort of nod in that direction, a sort of nominal minister for veterans of the armed forces, both in the Westminster UK government and the Scottish government. But most of the practical work is done by charities. And I know this in Scotland. In Scotland, the ex-service welfare charities for all 3 services, there are 70 of them, 70 charities. And all of them are funded to a certain extent by central government because I call it the Pontius Pilate. They wash their hands of the veterans and palm them off to charities because that's the easy thing to do. And I've been writing quite a lot recently about how central government really needs to stop doing that in the UK and needs to set up a proper Department of State funded with a minister, civil servants, etc., who specifically look at, and all veterans really need is they need health, they need employment, they need housing, and they need specialist healthcare as well. So, but it's all done by a myriad of different charities who sort of overlap, duplicate. Sometimes there are huge gaps, and that's why it's really difficult. It's a continuous. I don't know whether it's the same in Spain or Catalonia, but you know the streets of Scotland are not absolutely full of homeless veterans begging, but there's quite a lot of them, and it's a sad thing to see.
Mr. Crawford,
Yes.
You talk about at the moment of independence or during the negotiations, it is expected that some part of the material that is an equipment that is owned by the British military will transfer to the Scottish military. Is it expected that a similar thing will happen with personnel, at least on an individual level or at the regimental level maybe?
And that's another really good question, because I think that if you were to ask people serving in the military, in Scottish regiments say, some of them would transfer because they'd want to be part of a new army, if you like. Just use the army as an example. And others would not. And I think the only thing that is practical is that those people currently serving in the UK military should be given the option and opportunity, and indeed encouraged to join the Scottish military. But I don't think there's any way you could force them. And as for the traditional Scottish regiments, well, they have been reduced in number over the years. But I don't think that Scotland was independent. The Royal Regiment of Scotland would be a UK regiment. It would revert to being a Scottish regiment. But whether it could bring all its personnel with it is another question altogether. And I think also there's, it sounds terribly old-fashioned, but I think that there would be quite an amount of influence from the officers in those regiments. And I don't mean pro-UK or pro-Scotland. They're equally strong views, but I think they would have a major influence on that as well. So again, nobody's really worked it out. It's one of these things that people say, well, we haven't really thought of that. But it's definitely something that has to be considered, no doubt. Thank you for your question.
David.
You were joking about your skills in the army, but so I wanted to ask specifically about this too. Well, which were your main skills you got there as a professional?
As a soldier, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, bear in mind I was in a combat unit. I mean, all units are combat, but I was in a tank regiment. And, you know, you don't get much more combat than that. And so, whereas in some branches of the armed services, you know, perhaps do engineering, mechanical engineering, supply and logistics, all that sort of stuff. My only skill, I used to say, was to lead men into pretend battle because we had no enemy. And so, I say again, I could attack any town, hold any bridge, but there's no direct, obvious transfer into the civilian world. But in terms of skills, well, at Sandhurst, the military academy, you learn leadership skills. You definitely lead, not just officers, you learn organizational skills. And to the extent that when I was a serving officer, there's almost no task that could be given, either military or completely random, that would faze me, that would trouble me, because I'd just assume that I would be able to do it somehow. So yeah, organizational skills, leadership skills, things like that. But to persuade a civilian boss who hasn't been in the military and hasn't experienced that is really, really difficult, because what he or she wants to know is, how much money can you make me? You know, and driving tanks is not designed to make money, so it's difficult.
Daniel?
Yes, you talked about professional army, non-conscript-based army, and there's another option about self-defense, regional volunteers, partial time. Or what do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I think it's a great idea actually, because if you're struggling, certainly in the early days of a new young country with budgets and money, and one assumes that's going to be the case, you can, depending on how you mix it, you can reduce your number of what I would call regular serving professional soldiers and introduce a proportion of reserve soldiers who will do it in their part-time, if you like. We used to have a thing called the Territorial Army in Britain. It's now called the Reserve Force. And I think that, and they're trained to the same standards, but because they're not doing it day in, day out, 24/7, inevitably they're not going to be quite as proficient as the full-time regulars. And I think the important thing is to get the proportion correct, because if you introduce too many reserve soldiers who are not as well trained, and it's not their fault they're not as well. If you introduce too many of those, then the balance of the unit changes and it becomes less proficient. So I suggested 70% regular professionals and 30% reservists, and that's really for a combat unit. If you're looking at a logistics unit where the work that the part-time soldiers are doing in uniform is more or less the same as they're doing in the civilian jobs, then you can have many, many more reservists. And that's what really, if you look at the UK's medical services, for example, all the army doctors tend to be doctors from our National Health Service who are brought in. All the nurses tend to be National Health Service, and they're part-time soldiers, so they do work in the hospitals and around the UK, and then whatever it is, 6 weekends a year, they put up a big tent with a Red Cross and do the military training. And certainly in the first Gulf War, I think all our medical support units were part-time reservists. So it's the balance, I think, is the important thing.
Right.
So, I wanted to dig a bit deeper on the topic of veterans and how, on the psychological side of the thing, how veterans returning civilian life, the psychological aspect of it, if it's more difficult with modern training as in the Gulf War, as in Iraq, as in this kind of Middle Eastern wars, as compared to training before. How the psychological aspect of it?
No, well, I think I sort of alluded to that when I answered you last time. First of all, today's armies are much smaller, so the number of post-service veterans going into the civilian community proportionally is much smaller than it was, say, in 1945, when 6 million men went back into civilian life in about 6 months. So that's the thing. I think the major psychological aspect of it is going from a regimented regime, particularly as a younger person, where maybe you have gone to the army to get some structure into your life, and you know that you're going to be well fed, well trained, well looked after, but you're going to have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and make your bed, and discipline, self-discipline. And I think going from, if you like, what I would call the regimental family, where you have all your friends and comrades around you, you all do the same things, you share the same things in peacetime and in wartime, and then to leave the services, so you leave a body with an identity, and you become an individual. And I think a lot of people find that really, really psychologically difficult, particularly if they've, unfortunately picked up something like PTSD or something like that in a combat situation. And, it's a big, cruel world out there, and the army is, I'm not talking about the army because I know it best, the army is not a big, cruel world. It can be rough, but there's always someone there to look after you, always. Even if it's your sergeant major that you're terrified of, he will look after you. So that sort of collective cohesion goes, and I think a lot of people find that psychologically very difficult to deal with, being sort of thrown out into the wide world and not really. So a bit like, sadly, coming out of prison after doing time. A lot of prisoners, certainly in the UK, go straight back into prison because they want the security of a context that they understand.
Yeah, go on.
I would like to ask, I think that, I'm not exactly sure, but I think that the Scottish nationalist comes from a left-wing tradition,
Yep.
pacifist, anti-NATO and this, and how has it come to accept the need to have an armed force, to be integrated into NATO and all that? No? How has gone this journey from these positions to the current acceptance of this status quo? No?
Well, I mean, the short answer is it hasn't. It hasn't, but it is moving along the road. And the example I would give you, the background of the SNP is that it was, to a certain extent, quite a large extent, it was born out of the CND movement in the 60s and 70s. And so a lot of the older members of the SNP have come from the anti-nuclear political movement, which is fine. But I think in practical terms, the SNP has always been criticised as being poor in its defence understanding. In fact, they say defence is the SNP's Achilles heel, and I think that's absolutely true. So they've had to adapt to become more credible. And the best example of that was that for years and years and years, the SNP party policy was that it would not join NATO, and if it was in NATO when it became independent, the country became independent, it would leave NATO. And that was passed at conference with great acclaim, etc., etc. But some of the leaders of the party began to say, this is not politically a credible position, because we are the only country that we know of that's saying we will leave NATO, and there's hundreds of other countries wanting to join. But the vote to reverse the policy was passed in, I think, 2013, and it was passed by a really narrow majority, and lots of serving senior members of the SNP left the party because the attitude is that NATO is a nuclear-led alliance. That's the phrase everybody uses, and that an independent Scotland should have no part of an organisation which is nuclear-led. But pragmatically, NATO's the only game in town in defence terms at the moment. But there's great disquiet still in the ranks of the party membership about it.
Molt bé. Doncs sí. Endavant. Barra lliure, Gaeta.
I was curious about it's rate 55% against becoming independent and 45% in favor of, and could you explain more about the situation and why you think it's so stable?
Right, okay, so we're into politics now, always dangerous territory. I think that the pro-independence movement in Scotland has come leaps and bounds from where it was 25, 30 years ago. And there are two branches of the independence movement. And we'll bring some characters in here. There's what's called the fundamentalist branch, which is we want to be independent, and we want to be independent now, and nothing should get in our way. So the firebrands, if you like, the Young Turks. And there is the gradualist branch, which says that independence is a process and we have to take our time. And so, and, you know, we've been going on for 80. Yeah, we've been going on for 80 years. But that has now sort of manifested itself politically in Scotland, in that you have the SNP, the Party of Government in the Scottish Parliament, led by Nicola Sturgeon, which is gradualist, and its overarching approach is to prove that it's so competent and so impressive at what I would call governance, governing the country, which it does, that people will recognise that they're absolutely brilliant at it, and therefore why shouldn't we be independent? Because these people are brilliant. The problem is they're not brilliant at it. In fact, they're pretty awful at it, to be honest. And I could give you a huge list of things that have gone badly wrong in Scotland. I could talk for hours, but if you ever want to look at a complete and utter political procurement disaster, look at the procurement of new ferries for the Western Isles route in Scotland under the Calmac Company, where they're 5 years overdue and 3 times the price that they were meant to be. Total disaster. Hospital procurement, I mean, just so incompetent that it almost makes you cry. And huge sums of taxpayer, well, every country says huge sums of taxpayers' money being thrown to the wind because the politicians are incompetent. So you've got Nicola Sturgeon's side. Now, in the party itself, there has been a falling out between Nicola Sturgeon and her gradualists and the former First Minister, Alex Salmond. And Alex Salmond's fall from grace has been fairly spectacular, and it all revolved around the fact that his relations with his female members of... my daughter arrives. She's heard it all before. Alex Salmond's relationship with his female members of staff was totally inappropriate, which it was. Everybody knew it. But none of the papers would write about it. And the reason they wouldn't write about it was if they wrote about Alex Salmond having an inappropriate relationship in the newspapers, they would never get an interview with him again. And that's how power corrupts, power controls. But anyway, he was caught out eventually. And although he was found not guilty, his reputation is fairly trashed. So he has set up a new political party called ALBA, or I think in actual fact the Gaels pronounce it Alapa Party. And some of the SNP MPs have transferred across the new party, but electorally they have made no impact whatsoever and are struggling. And while Nicola Sturgeon, the current First Minister, was the protege of Alex Salmond in times gone by, they now don't speak to each other. So it's a real mess.
We are used to that. Molt bé, doncs si no hi ha cap més pregunta, no fem cobrar, no fem pagar, no patiu. En tot cas, thank you, Stuart.
My great pleasure.
I això, i un parell de coses més. Com sabeu, cada seminari procurem que hi hagi 3 ponències, en venen 2 més. La propera serà, sorpresa, sobre la Haganah, l'Organització de Defensa d'Israel prèvia a la independència, i la tercera serà sobre la Lliga de Defensa d'Estònia, o sigui, els voluntaris d'aquell país bàltic que encara existeixen avui en dia a banda de les forces regulars. Evidentment, entrada de franc, i esteu tots convidats i podeu dir-ho a qui més us plagui, vull dir, cap problema. De fet, ens omple d'orgull que els organitzadors siguem dels sèniors i que hi hagi més jovent. Vull dir, si no, la mena d'actes en aquest país són un cementeri d'elefants, ja sabem quins són, i no és el cas. Per tant, també, tercer punt, la SEM és una organització que no depèn i no volem subvencions públiques, ens ho paguem tots nosaltres. I a partir d'aquí, si voleu aportar el vostre talent i una mica de calarons a l'associació, us podeu fer socis o també tenim una mica de material, no arribem a ser l'ANC, però tenim samarretes, pagats i algun llibre hem fet, és a dir, el que no ha fet el govern. En qualsevol cas, aquí estem i pel que calgui, moltes gràcies per 5è any consecutiu.